So Vera and I actually met at the AVPM conference in Abu Dhabi this year, and actually we had a short conversation, but it was very impactful. We talked about the Korean CSO and NGO ecosystem, and throughout the conversation, I think we found that building trust between donors and recipient organization is a common problem, which is happening globally, including the United States. And in Korea, actually, when we think about the United States, it's we perceive it as a very progressive country who has an extensive given culture. So actually, we invited Dr. Vera to share stories about the US philanthropy and to give us some insights focusing on the given culture and the method called the effective philanthropy. So before we start our lecture, I would like to briefly speak about the bio of Dr. Vera. And she is the director of the Effective Philanthropic Learning Initiative and the senior research scholar at the Stanford PACS. With a master's degree from Harvard and a PhD from Stanford, she has worked in prestigious institutions such as the SRI International and Gordon Betty Moore Foundation. Her work focuses on harmonizing expectations between global philanthropists and organizations in developing countries and devising culturally relevant programs for effective philanthropy. Today, she will share insights on effective philanthropy and exploring strategies for maximizing positive social impact through strategic resource utilization with a focus on the US philanthropic scene. So everyone, please give Dr. Vera a big round of applause.
Thank you, everyone. It's much appreciated. I
Mhm.
hope this is relevant and interesting. And see the hands, relevant, interesting, and a little energizing because of the time of day it is for all of you, and you probably had a fairly long day. But I do want to say that in the past couple of years, doing philanthropic education and then having um, uh, many different types of career working with donors and helping them understand the nature of impact and learn from the data that we gather with their programs. It's really been um, both joyful and edifying. I've learned a lot over the last 20, 30 years doing this kind of work. And I just want to share, based on my wonderful conversation with Daniel, your anglicized name, I really so deeply appreciated your understanding of and insights about the history of philanthropy in the US. And you use the phrase giving culture and of course have invited me to speak about the US. And I do think that even though it's one country, even though it represents one cultural model and one sort of demographic, I think a lot of the issues that have come up in the US over the last 150 years are stimulating, can be thought of analogously to what may be happening in other parts of the world. And of course, there's always an interplay between every region globally, even if they're attenuated, even if they're complicated. I still think it should be relevant to what you're thinking about in your own work. Most of you are working for nonprofit NGO type organizations, as I understand it. So what I'm representing is really something of a scholarly approach to recognizing the field of giving and what donors think about and how the various trends and influences on giving culture have really influenced what's happened in the US and also what's happened globally. So I have slides to share, and I think yes, I think I'm in the right place. I'm always a little slow, but let me know. I think people are seeing my slides. I absolutely should go back to the beginning because right now I'm at the end. And um, yeah, and I can start the slideshow. So I just, the provocative question that I think is always a good way to start any any talk or any educational experience is really with a question that that ties together what the speaker is saying and what those of you participating in the audience are interested in. And when we talk about giving in the US, I want to just invite you to think how different it is from your understanding of giving in Korea and other parts of Asia, especially from the perspective of the nonprofit sector. And it's always good to think about pushing back and how you might challenge, I think, what a speaker such as me, who's coming from way outside your context, is saying. So my center is Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. It's been around about 20 years. Our goal has been to improve philanthropy, strengthen civil society, and affect social change, something that I think all of you can relate to in the nonprofit sector, the non-governmental sector that you work. We also published the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Also, there is a version published in Korean, right, Daniel? We've established this, but I just want to make sure that I'm getting that right. And I think Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, Spanish, I believe Portuguese. I'm not entirely sure, but we have multiple, I should know this off the top of my head, but multiple uh, uh, national issues. But really, I have loved this journal long before I had any affiliation with PACS. I think it's the preeminent journal in the nonprofit sector, especially looking at social change and how it gets motivated. Our group, the Effective Philanthropy Learning Initiatives, does research. We create tools and resources. Some of those tools and resources, I think, have been put into the chat. And we do educational programs like the one I'm doing right now. We have both shorter educational offerings and then up to 6 days of intensive work with donors. And we are interdisciplinary. We don't represent just sociology or just anthropology or just psychology. And we try to use a design thinking approach where we really think about end users. Ultimately, our goal is to make sure donors and donor supporters have really strong educational um, resources, but we're continually engaged in research, so that kind of drives many of our offerings. And so let me define effective philanthropy fairly quickly for you. We think that there are philanthropic practices kind of all over the map, but what we stand behind is, come on, advance, is that it be thoughtful, grounded in extensive understanding of the issue area in which donors want to operate, that the goals for every gift be clear, not that they be set in stone or stagnant or inflexible, but that there's a clear target, that donors are committed, not just in the short term, but in the long term. And they're committed in the sense of giving unrestricted gifts, gifts that are not restricted to particular projects, that support general operating funds, and that as often as possible, they be multi-year, and that the donor's commitment be based in a relationship with the grantee, that learning is always central, that however committed to a goal or to a strategy or to a theory of action, that donors stay open to actually changing their approach and actually adjusting course, adapting to circumstances, because nobody can really anticipate what is going to happen when implementation takes place. And that there's a trusting relationship between donors and grantees, especially to the point of not burdening grantees with undue reporting requirements, undue expectations that grantees will be just telling donors what they want to hear, as opposed to really having a dynamic relationship where there's mutual learning. I will ask our Asan Frontier Academy leaders to stop me if there are questions that arise. I am going to try to move quickly through a lot of content, but if there's something that people feel is important to ask, I will invite you to ask. I did carefully look at the questions that were put forth, which are a little bit more on the specific and technical side. And I think that some of the things I say will be quite relevant to those questions. But for those of you who pose the questions, I absolutely invite you to follow up with me. And I have some specific ideas for how we, for example, um, uh, market, represent an organization, do collectives and collaboratives, understand the impact of things like the toolkit that Stanford PACS offers. These are some of the questions that were asked, and I'm really happy to respond to those. Moving on. And doing so at an ungodly hour. I know you know that I'm I'm in a strange time zone and I've just finished traveling, but I am extremely excited to be here with you despite my my less than well-rested facial features, if you notice that. So, what are some of the big issues in philanthropy? And we define philanthropy as voluntary giving for the common good. It is not coerced, and it's for a greater good than that of the donor. The big issues are, do donors address symptoms or do they address causes? And I think you all can think of examples where something's more symptomatic, such as people not having enough to eat that day, or causes, say, inequitable economic systems. Those would be a cause of people not having enough to eat. Is giving for the elites or for everyone? And one of the interesting issues around this is that the more we democratize giving, the more we make it easy for every man, for everyday donors to give to important causes, the more the ultra wealthy say, look, it's democratic. It's not, philanthropy isn't just a matter of elites using their financial sway and financial power to change the world according to their image. Big issue right now. Do the donors have control or should communities have control? And ultimately, the donors are the ones giving the money. But many of the newer movements in philanthropy, as I think many of you are aware, are about beneficiary, grantee, community control. Interestingly, we'll get to the issue of cash giving, which has proven in many instances to be a very effective way of building community autonomy. But many people think that that's just old school charity, and we should be building services that change systems and actually address more root causes and not give cash directly to beneficiaries. Big deal in the field right now is, are there best causes or right causes versus being open to the pluralism that donors bring to the field when they follow their own values, their own interests, and their own beliefs about what needs to be done in the world. And there are a couple of different schools of what the right causes are. There's the causes of justice and racial equity that is very prominent in the US right now. And then there's the school of effective altruism, which um, claims to use scientific approaches to determine the best place to give money for the greatest good. So that's a real tension in the field right now. Is philanthropy about innovation in the broad sense of trying to come up with new models for social change, or is it about supplementing what the public sector, that is, what government and the state doesn't do, and what the private sector or business doesn't do? So is it risk capital for innovating where the government and business don't want to go because it's too risky? or is it a supplement to what the government and business don't want to do? Given those big issue questions, and I hope that we see how the history of philanthropy in the US addresses a lot or complicates a lot of those questions, I'm going to do a few basics about US philanthropy. And again, I'm counting on my Asan Frontier Academy leaders to interrupt me with questions if there are some burning ones. But here are some basics. Philanthropy in the US takes a few different forms. We have oops, sorry, I can't control my mouse. We have individual giving, which isn't just cash, just contributions to charities. It's also voluntary time and connections, and it's contributions for political advocacy. Sometimes we talk about the 4 T's, which is treasure, money, time that you give. Oh gosh, I'm not remembering them right now. One of them is testimony, that is, advocating in certain ways. What are the other T's? One of them is ties, social ties to other people. These are forms of charitable or philanthropic giving in some new definitions. And then I sometimes talk about trajectory, like life trajectories. Um, where a young person graduating college has 80,000 hours to give in their career, and they can give that in the public sector. I mean, not the public sector. I meant to say the nonprofit sector, and be working on nonprofits. Anyway, my 4 T's and 6 T's. I was pretty close to getting there. Tax-exempt nonprofit organizations, the second of these rows, includes your private foundations, your public charities where they collect money from donors of all types to give out, and we have some organizations like United Way that would count in that mode. And then DAFs, donor advised funds, which are a huge part of the expanding philanthropic sector right now because donors can get the tax benefit of putting their money into a DAF and not worrying about where it's going to go for a while. And there's a lot of controversy about that because the DAF sponsors can use those funds as they please, and donors aren't required to turn that money to actual philanthropic good in a timely fashion, in the way that a private foundation must do, which a private foundation has to give away at least 5% of its endowment every year in order to 5% equivalent to its endowment every year in order to keep its tax exempt status. And then there are forms of for-profit philanthropy that are rather new. Uh, Lorene Powell Jobs, the Emerson Collective, Pierre Omidyar, who founded, I believe, eBay and PayPal, um, uh, the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Mark Zuckerberg. A lot of these people operate in a limited liability company, which means they don't get tax benefits, but they also have none of the public reporting requirements that one would have otherwise. And then lastly, is impact investing, where there's a below market rate of return on investments, but those investments stimulate giving and um, and um, models of social return that wouldn't happen otherwise. So they're filling a niche, they're filling a void that either in terms of drawing in other donors or getting a company of some small sort started that would not happen otherwise. So these are, some of the big ways that we operate in the field here, and I'm sure there are analogs around the world. I'm not as familiar with the structures that are um, in place elsewhere in the world. Okay, so private foundations, there's 47,000 of them in the US. Ford, Bill and Melinda Gates, Getty Foundation. I think you're familiar with these names, and sort of how they operate. Community foundations are something that do exist in other parts of the world, but they're a rather different beast from a private foundation. They pool local donations to benefit a certain geography. The Silicon Valley Community Foundation is one of the only ones I know of that actually gives globally, even though they have a geographic home, because of the influx of immigrants and so many ways in which what happens in the Silicon Valley is tied to other parts of the world. We've talked a little bit about Emerson, Omidyar, Chan Zuckerberg. They are not very interested in sharing their operations and their and information about them, which and they don't get any nonprofit tax benefits, but they still work for social benefit overall through impact investing, through some direct grants, through a large array of ways they use their capital. And then there's this other thing, and I say this other thing because PACS, the organization that that I work for, belongs in this category, and that's the ever-expanding sector of advisors and consultants. Some of them operate globally, like Bridgespan, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors. There are also donor membership organizations of a variety of sorts. Some of them are next generation, third generation wealth holders who collect together to do things in a collaborative way. And then there's research institutes like Stanford, like the Lilly School of Philanthropy at Indiana University, that also operate kind of within the philanthropic ecosystem, but aren't donors per se. So 64% of giving in the US comes from individuals, 21% by foundations. There's also bequest, that is estate giving, and then there's corporate giving. And you may be surprised to see corporate giving being as low as it is, since corporations really make a big deal out of their giving. But it's really not that much for the total sector. And even though the sector is the philanthropic giving is about 2% of our GDP, but it has probably an outsized influence on society, because it affects the nonprofit sector in a lot of intellectual and other forms of influence that we probably will get to in this conversation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the origin of institutional giving in the US, because it really sets a stage for where we are now. And it and I loved Daniel bringing up de Tocqueville and his observations about the affiliative nature and associative and associational nature of American culture, which this French sociologist back in the 1840s, I think, was it the 30s, was it the 50s, I'm forgetting, really characterized the American difference, the distinctiveness of the United States. And that really is in how much people relied on one another in these informal institutional, semi-institutional collectives where they took care of one another. And that, in a lot of ways, is where Americans think of their their nonprofit sector, and its grounding. Back in the 1890s, and the later part of the 1800s, I should say, we were in the Gilded Age, where we had some of the most extremes between wealth and poverty, and we called it the time of plenty and the time of 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 incredible, really just like some of the greatest poverty the US have seen. It was a result of industrialization. Workers had very few rights, and anyway, the pictures sort of say it all. At this time, there was also a lot of discussion about whether one should give to the poor, because the argument was that giving to the poor just caused dependency on handouts, and made the social problems worse, which was kind of ironic because the problems really were because of the economic structures of the time. But it's out of that time that some of the biggest philanthropists and the fundamental structure of private giving and philanthropy for social change came into play. Andrew Carnegie, who maybe was the wealthiest man of in American history and maybe of all time, adjusted for today's money, was a great industrialist, and thought that inequality was natural and good, that successful people whose success demonstrated their special talents through their success would do the best job of anyone of determining what would make for public good. And he also thought there was a worthiness that needed to be demonstrated by beneficiaries. Not everybody was equally worthy. Not everybody was equally talented. Not everybody was equally deserving of wealth. And those in the positions of great wealth um, um, were in the position of making determinations for those who were poorer. One of the most important legacies that he gave was he funded over 2,500 libraries in the U.S., which really are this really remarkable legacy because they still stand as kind of the centerpiece in many communities. And even though with technological change, a house of learning that has books, print books per se, isn't as important. Libraries, which I've done a lot of work in over my career, still have a really central role in many communities and have become the alternative learning space, offering digital and other resources that aren't available otherwise. But he turned the libraries over to the communities. Communities needed to keep supporting them over time. And he claimed that this is not charity, it's people helping themselves by taxing themselves. And he was opposed to charity. He was one of those who thought giving to the poor was a waste, a full-on waste, and that we should only be changing systems. And one of the ways that he sought to change systems were creating these palaces of the people, which embodied the knowledge that a community could access to make itself better. Libraries, in a word. So he came down strongly on the side of elites and strongly on the side of donor control, but with some turning over of responsibility to communities. So getting back to some of our big issues. John D. Rockefeller, who was an oil tycoon, had a little bit of a different approach and championed scientific philanthropy. He actually was a little bit more on the side of beneficiaries, worked with communities in the South to significantly reduce hookworm infection. And it turns out that much of the inability of children in the South to energize themselves in relation to school opportunities and professional opportunities were because they were sick and infected with hookworm. And a lot of them were infected because they didn't own shoes. So he countered the stereotype of lazy Southerners and helped create the first real public health infrastructure in the southern part of the United States, which is traditionally the poorest part of the United States. A man named Julius Rosenwald, who's a kind of a personal hero of mine, built over 5,000 schools to offer educational opportunities for Black children who didn't have them otherwise, who weren't provided educational opportunities by the government. There is Julius Rosenwald in the picture with Booker T. Washington, who was one of the great educators of Black Americans. And that's the map of the 5,000 schoolhouses he built in the South. I have a very dear friend who was educated in one of the Rosenwald schools, and many currently well-educated Black Americans can trace what their families achieved educationally to his schools. He was one of the founders of one of the a great retail empire, the Sears Roebuck Empire, and he also was very involved in the communities and really learned from them and spent a lot of time with them. So wasn't a perfect individual, but a great individual that gave out of the um, out of a sense of religious conviction of what the benefits of having wealth meant as an American Jew who felt that his responsibility was to give back, and he did. So in his case, there was a little bit more turning over to community control. Rockefeller similarly gave more voice to people in the South. And then when it came to innovation, the public health system and the educational system created by Rockefeller and Rosenwald, respectively, were both fairly notably innovative in the American South. So, done with the history, going to move on to some kinds of philanthropic successes that really represent American cultures of giving. We did talk about Rockefeller going into a riskier place, and in general, we think of philanthropy serving as risk capital, where, as I mentioned, not funded by government or business, is really, in many ways, arguably the best role of philanthropy. Philanthropy has also been quite dramatically effective in the US in changing mindsets. Um, a lot of the labor laws and a lot of the best changes that happened in the early part of the 20th century were supported by philanthropists. We've seen a very interestingly effective conservative movement in the 1970s, law and economics, that actually deregulated much of what was standard in US economic practice, business practice, and opened up US business for the neoliberal, the highly deregulated, the shareholders matter entirely, stakeholders not at all, the Chicago School of Economics with Milton Friedman and others who really think that business should be unfettered by government regulation. And there's a real tension in the US around that. And in fact, legalization of same-sex marriage in the US was largely supported by foundations. So a lot of mindsets and social change uh, happening at the broad social level through strategic efforts by philanthropists. Also, we've seen philanthropy strengthen public institutions. Again, this gets kind of to the risk capital mode, like the Head Start program, which is a preschool program for low-income students started by the Ford Foundation, adopted by the government, extremely effective and proven to be to decrease criminal activity, um, later poverty in life, all sorts of really positive benefits. Um, the Foundation for Detroit's Future helped Detroit emerge from bankruptcy in just 16 months. In Stockton, California, not far from where I am, direct cash um, uh, uh, contributions to families showed very positive outcomes. And the new venture fund helped stop a co-opting of the US Census during Trump's term, when there were a lot of threats to having an accurate and free and open census. Right now in the US, philanthropy is keeping journalism, free and independent journalism, alive when so many journalistic efforts have fallen victim to economic models that do not sustain free and open journalistic practice. So thinking about those and how they serve the common good, there's a plurality, as you can see there, of ways in which philanthropy has served society, and there is no one right cause. And we stand in, sort of argument. I stand in opposition to the idea that there's any one right way to give or any one right type of organization to give to, and we'll see more of that in the critique section, which we're entering now. Critiques of philanthropy have been with us from the very beginning, and Rockefeller and Carnegie were not beloved to the average American. Stanford was in the same league with these folks, and he was part of the robber baron um, uh, class that in the late 19th century was considered antithetical to democratic norms. And when you start wielding your giving power to shape public policy and to create institutions, especially when your workers are not having the kinds of benefits that you would think they deserve as contributing to that great wealth. There's certainly going to be critique, same critiques that we see of Jeff Bezos right now, of less so of Elon Musk, certainly of Mark Zuckerberg, who has, and Bill Gates as well, who have ventured into some really not just non-productive, but counterproductive philanthropic efforts in their lives, especially in education, which is kind of interesting. And that's the field I came up in, where what Gates spent $500 million on, what Zuckerberg has spent a lot of money on, have proven in many instances to be counterproductive. And that, of course, is anti-democratic. And the claim that philanthropy can whitewash tainted money or misdeeds or ill-gotten gains has been around with us for a long time. There were notable actual massacres in some of the oil fields and other business um, uh, profit centers for some of these early philanthropists, which created obviously backlash. So tainted money, the Sackler family, responsible largely for the opioid crisis in the US, which amounts to tens of thousands of deaths a year. They have given money to medical schools, to museums, to other institutions, and the idea that the Sackler name should not be on these buildings. My daughter went to medical school at a Sackler-funded medical school that was the Sackler School of Medicine at Tufts University, and during her time there, they effectively got the Sackler name taken down. Uh, the notable Epstein, whose first name is escaping me right now, but he was very involved in giving at to MIT, and that money was considered tainted and brought down several prominent people on campus there. The photo here is of my colleague Rob Reich, who's a political scientist and philosophy professor at Stanford, who really argues against the charitable tax deduction because it progressively favors the wealthier you are, the more you get tax benefits from giving charitably, and it's a regressive benefit because it benefits the wealthier more. And there's a lot that can be changed in the 1969 tax code to make philanthropy less advantageous to wealthier donors, and allow for more influence by a broader sector of less affluent donors. And then there's a huge concern that donors get to dictate too much. They limit the power of recipient choices and disrespect their autonomy. One of our dear colleagues, Emma Saunders Hastings, writes about paternalism in philanthropy. And Jane Addams, one of the early nonprofit organizers in the US, argued that unless everybody and all classes contribute to a good, we cannot even be sure that a good is worth having. In other words, it shouldn't be the elite that determine what kinds of determine what a social good is and block the decision-making power of the beneficiaries and of generally of the middle and lower economic echelons of society. Just a really recent example, Charlie Munger, who is a colleague of Warren Buffett's, an extraordinarily wealthy man, offered to build a $200 million dorm at UC, University of California, Santa Barbara, but it had to have windowless bedrooms, windowless living spaces, and be massive for 4,500 students, because in his mind, that would make students more productive because they would socialize in these central spaces, work on their problem sets and academic work together, and all become a lot smarter. And it would be an architectural disaster, um, and probably depress every student that lived there. And I believe his money was turned down. So, what are some corrective approaches? I have to hurry because we're coming up to the end of my allocated 50 minutes, and then we have time for questions at the end. Um, what are some corrective approaches? Trust-based philanthropy, less controlling, less paternalistic, reducing the reporting burden, providing unrestricted funding, and heightening transparency. And the most important part of trust-based philanthropy, according to its um, founders and advocates, is that there be as equal as possible a relationship between the philanthropist and recipient, but that there be conversations, there be mutual accountability, that there not be as transactional a relationship between donors and grantees, but there be much more mutual understanding of how the money is being spent and how it can be spent increasingly well with learning about the projects that are being undertaken. Participatory philanthropy is in many ways very similar, but putting even more um, weight in the community decision making. The phrase "nothing about us without us" it really captures this, that nobody should be doing something about somebody else without including those people. Greater democracy, more representation um, from the beneficiaries should lead to better ideas and outcomes, and we have a few examples of that at the bottom. Increasingly, donors are giving collectively and collaboratively. Here is Sarah Lomelin, one of our partners, who leads something called Philanthropy Together, where she effectively represents a number of collectives and collaboratives and helps people find their group, their tribe, the place where they can collectively give and share information to better understand the sector. Also, blended capital, working across the continuum of capital between outright don't giving to more strategically giving in a business-like way, to impact investing, which is giving with fiscal return, and then being socially responsible in one's investment, that is excluding, for example, investing in tobacco companies or nuclear energy if you find that to be reprehensible, or any discriminatory organizations. And now one of the biggest negative screens for not investing would be things that contribute to climate change, and so oil companies and other largely polluting entities. I want to mention effective altruism because it has really big influence in the world right now, and it's sort of the most hyper rational of the movements, contemporary movements. It speaks in terms of maximizing well-being, in terms of dollars, claims to be highly scientific. They specify optimal causes like bed nets in Africa. You can save more lives that way than you can in other ways. They argue against things like funding cultural organizations, the arts, when you can be saving lives. Why would you spend money on getting new artists into the field? Um, and they have a real penchant and desire to mitigate against some of the riskiest scenarios that we face, whether it's um, climate disaster or artificial intelligence disaster. And there's an element called long-termism. The man on the bottom right, William McCaskill, who's a philosopher at Oxford, thinks the most important things we should do, since we can potentially save trillions of human lives if you extend our imagination into the future, is to protect against anything that would end humanity, and they put their bets on AI being the biggest threat, and so a lot of that money is going into trying to protect um, humanity from annihilation through artificial intelligence. Um, a lot of people think that's a foolish and an unsophisticated way to approach the future, and effective altruism is often critiqued because certain brands of it have taken an end justified means approach, saying the best thing somebody who cares about the world can do is make as much money as possible and give it to effective altruist endorsed causes. And we have a very close to home example of Sam Bankman-Fried, who built a cryptocurrency empire and ended up committing fraud and is now sentenced to 25 years in prison. And both of his parents teach at Stanford Law School and are affiliates of ours. So you can tell that I'm not a big fan of that aspect of what has happened. So I'm going to give you like a 3-minute view of the core philosophic. And the man at the top here, Peter Singer, is really the philosophical founder of effective altruism. But the argument is this, and many people buy into the argument, that let's take this lady, she's going to work, she's got maybe she's going to a job interview, a beautiful brand new suit on, nice shoes, all ready to go. She's walking across a bridge and she hears a child screaming. They would drown were it not for her to jump in and save the child. Of course, her suit is not as important as the child's life, even though her suit is ruined. And the argument there philosophically is, why is saving the life of the boy next to you in the pond any more important than saving the life of a starving child continents away? So why wouldn't you live as frugally as possible and give all the money you possibly can, just above your own poverty level, to save the lives of others in the world, even, at the expense of the simple things in life like having a nice suit? And it's a pretty compelling philosophical argument in a lot of ways. And for the last 30, 40 years, people have made counter arguments to it. But this is the heart of the effective altruist movement. Um, so kind of talked a little bit about what some people advocate as the right cause. I'm sort of right at time, but I'm going to take another 60 seconds. Is that okay? Yes. Okay. So
Totally fine.
my group spends a lot of time educating people about how to build strategy, how to create a theory of change where you have an ultimate outcome. We say always start on the right column. Where do you want to go? Think about what activities you can invest in, and then who needs to take what action in the middle to get you to that outcome. And we have an extensive process. We have a several-hour training. We want people to think strategically, not because trust doesn't matter, relationships not because relationships don't matter, not because of anything, but just because we think that it's important for people to have a plan so that their money can be spent wisely and not be wasted. And we don't think strategy is in opposition to trust or relationship. We just think it's a good thing to start with a plan for where you're going. with plenty of opportunity to adjust along the way. This is my particular area of interest and expertise, and that is, how does the research knowledge, what does the literature say, and what others have tried, and what might be extrapolated from in potentially relevant research feed into the strategy that you're attempting? When you're attempting that strategy during the implementation phase of your philanthropic work, what is happening? Try to look and get a direct take on what's happening. What needs to change in your strategy to make it work better? And what's the best evidence for that? Where are you looking? And then after or later in the mature phase of a nonprofit implementation, you have to ask, did it work? You have to ask, how do you know? And what's your comparison or counterfactual? Those are all part of knowing whether something worked. One of the classic and worst examples is this play pump, which was supposed to be a fun merry-go-round for kids in Africa that would draw water up from the ground, and many of you may know about this, but in fact, it took too much labor to pull water up. There were insufficient water table pressure for it to work, so the kids never did it because it wasn't fun. If you want kids to use a merry-go-round, it has to be fun. So moms ended up having to do it, and they felt like they were beasts of burden turning this thing around. And it was an abysmal failure. I think after many, many, many were built in Africa, and it failed to create better water resources in the communities that it was implemented. My historical recollection is a little fuzzy, but that's basic idea. So Paul Brest, who is the faculty director of my group and was the president of the Hewlett Foundation for a dozen years, currently is just stepping down from his second term of dean of Stanford Law School as interim dean, and was dean of Stanford Law School for many years. This is his favorite cartoon in the whole wide world, and every time he teaches a class, he asks students to explain it. And the idea is very simple but very profound. Wolves howl at the full moon and they're howling to bring the sun up, and one wolf turns to another and says, my question is, are we making an impact? What is the counterfactual? If the wolves didn't do this howling, would the moon still go away and the sun rise? And that really is the question. Is the program that you're creating making a difference against you not doing anything at all, against a comparison group where somebody does something different? There really always has to be a counterfactual. You never really know if the change over time is occurring just because of general social factors or something else, or whether it's your program per se that makes a difference. But that kind of study is really expensive and really hard to do and can only really be done on mature programs. So there's lots of other ways we try to amass evidence for whether a program is working. I think I'm done.
Okay, thank you.
Philanthropy's potential, it can function as risk capital, create both public institutions like libraries, as well as hold government and businesses accountable to the public by showing them what can be done and challenging them and influencing policy. It can create mindsets around public issues and serve as a laboratory for democracy if you bring the ideas in from the beneficiaries. I'm only about 5 minutes over. Not too bad, right?
It was a perfect lecture. I was so intrigued about the U.S. philanthropic sector and so many points to think and question about. So I think we can get some questions from the floor. So if anyone has questions, please raise your hand. You can definitely use the raise your hand button. So I'll count to like 5, and if there's no question, I'll proceed to the questions. Oh, okay. Young Ray? 예, 마이크 켜시면 됩니다. 마이크 안 들려요.
네,
지금
여러분이
예.
들리세요? 들리세요?
Before we start our question session, Vera, we are supporting simultaneous translations. So
Yes.
if you click the globe thing and turn it into English, definitely.
Gosh, I've never done that before.
English.
Interpretation.
So,
Got it.
okay, so there's a globe
I got it.
in the
Yeah.
bar. Yep.
Yeah, and I made it English.
Yep. Great. So 영래님 혹시 다시 질문해 주실 수 있을까요? 영래님
네,
질문 가능하세요?
안녕하세요. 네, 들리세요? 네, 베라 박사님 강의 정말 잘 들었습니다. 안녕하세요. 저는 서울에 있는 중랑구에 있는 지역사회복지관에서 일하고 있는 사회복지사입니다. 저희는 지역사회 주민들의 관계를 연결하면서 지역사회 주민의 변화를 촉진하는 일을 하고 있고요. 저희 기관에 올해 20년이 된 지역사회 주민 후원 조직이 있습니다. 매월 1만 원 이상 수익 후원자를 개발하고 지역 내 모금 활동을 통해서 얻어진 후원금으로 긴급하게 어려움이 생긴 가정에게 주거비나 생계비, 보초치과 치료비 등을 지원하는 활동을 하고 있는데요. 이 단체가 20년이 되다 보니까 후원 조직에 참여하고 있는 회원들의 연령대가 고령화되고 또 사회활동도 그전보다는 저조해지는 상황입니다. 이에 따라서 후원금이 좀 줄어들기도 하고 또는 조직의 어떤 동기부여나 그 활동들이 좀 약해지고 있어서 현재 좀 많이 좀 고민이 좀 되고 있고 올해 이제 저희가 가을에 20주년 행사를 하는데 젊은 세대의 어떤 후원자 개발이나 조직의 어떤 새로운 분위기를 형성하는 과제를 안고 있고요. 특히 저희가 지역사회가 39만 되는 서울에 있는 자치구고 기업이 전혀 없고 어떤 재정 자립도가 약한 자치구에 있다 보니까 그런 부분에 있어서 이 어떤 후원 조직이 20년 된 부분들을 좀 잘 이어서 또 새로운 어떤 동기를 부여하고 새롭게 힘을 받아야 될 텐데 좀 어떻게 하면 좋을지에 대한 고민이 좀 되고 또 이와 관련된 지역사회 내 후원 조직과 관련된 좀 좋은 사례가 있으면 그것도 소개 좀 부탁드리겠습니다. 네, 이상입니다.
Yeah, and we face something similar in the US in some ways because a lot of it comes back in some ways to that charity systems changed uh a point that where there's a tension right now. And many younger donors don't want to just give to support the needs in a community. However, what we're seeing, and this is what I want to say, is that if you can frame this differently, if you can use a different marketing approach in a way, and show that the research shows that actually giving people the immediate services and support they need is not a waste of money, which many people think, but instead is one of the more progressive and we've come full circle back to this kind of giving being more innovative. Perhaps that will attract the younger donors. We see younger donors say, "Oh, I don't want to give charitably. I don't want to give to philanthropy. I want to do something really innovative on my own. I want to be a founder of an organization." And yet that is really not the best approach, according to many of our, both research insights and then understanding how important it is to maintain and continue effective programs. There's an institute in the US called the Frameworks Institute, and they talk about your framing language being so critical in making a difference socially. And I do think that some of the newer trends would actually, if you could capitalize on how some of the younger donors recognize those trends and use, the language that resonates with them, you know, to us, it's just, so much of it is effectively marketing. And I hate to put it on marketing, but one reason I talked about the trends so much is because I do think it's possible to capitalize and leverage those to appeal to a younger generation. Not a very satisfactory answer, but really what we see other charitable organizations struggling with.
네, 말씀 주시고 싶으신 거 추가로 있으면 말씀 주시고 없으면 넘어가도록 하겠습니다. 다음 질문은 혹시 그 손드는 그 기능 활용하시면 좋을 것 같아요. 그러면 영욱 선생님, 예, 지금 목소리가 안 들립니다. 예, 그러면 아직도 안 들리는데 그 지금 고치시는 동안 그 혹시 다른 질문이나 이렇게 이제 들립니다. 예.
네, 들리시나요?
예.
네, 안녕하세요. 청소년의 꿈을 키워주는 일을 하고 있는 안병욱이라고 합니다. 오늘 교수님께서 들려주신 강의 중에 그 마지막 늑대 그림과 그 여성의 그림 그 두 가지로 강의 전체가 쉽게 요약되고 정리되는 느낌을 받았습니다. 너무 의미 있는 시간이었고요. 그리고 그 기관 안에서 자선 사업 전문가 교육을 한다는 것에 매우 흥미가 갔습니다. 어, 자선을 하는 것에도 특별한 교육과 그리고 방향성을 제시해준다는 것에 되게 의미가 있다 생각하고요. 그 자선가 전문 교육에서 그 자선가들이 자신의 자선 사업을 선택할 때 하는 기준에 대해서도 한번 알고 싶고요. 그 기준을 저희가 안다면 저희가 그 자선 사업을 통해서 또 더 나은 사업들을 진행할 수 있는 방향성을 가지게 될 거라고 생각합니다. 그리고 많은 연구들을 통해서 그 기관의 관심이나 앞으로의 비전을 볼 수 있었는데요. 그 과정 안에 외로움에 대한 연구는 찾아보질 못했는데요. 어, 사람들의 외로움이나 고립에 대한 연구는 혹시 없었는지, 앞으로 관심은 없으신지도 알고 싶습니다.
That's a really interesting question. It's in so many ways, it goes back to the original observation about American society being one where there's a lot of affiliation and a lot of association, and that has fallen off very dramatically in the last 50 years or so. And I think um, we as an organization, we do support and fund and study um, how polarization gets overcome. I think the idea of polarization where people are in opposition to one another and resent people who have differing views is a piece of the loneliness um, epidemic. I think that the fact that we rely so much on large institutions and people are joining affiliative organizations much less, associations much less, and are doing much more alone, and that's also affected by digital media. All of these things tie in together and also, I think, affect philanthropic giving, especially of time and volunteerism. And I think where what you are describing and what our research interests are is really around the idea of where people contribute time and connect with one another and collectively and collaboratively try to solve social problems. So our research would be more around how are people coming together to make social change, and that would affect their sense of commonality and their sense of belonging. Sense of belonging is a really, really important psychological um, uh, construct and need that we're beginning to understand dramatically affects people's lives. But we work with Stanford psychologists that study that, but we ourselves don't do that in my group. But I think it's a very important part of this whole sense of how those who care about shaping society give of themselves to shape society.
예, 또 추가로 질문 있으시면 손 수시로 이렇게 말씀 주시면 좋을 것 같아요. 예, 연재 선생님.
네, 베라 박사님 강의 너무나 잘 들었고요. 강의에서 미국의 자선의 역사와 자선 행위를 바라보는 철학적 고찰과 현재 이슈에 대해서 다방면으로 알 수 있어서 너무 좋았습니다. 저는 이야기를 가진 사람과 재능을 가진 아티스트를 연결하는 창작기금과 재능을 연결하는 플랫폼을 만들고 있습니다. 오늘 강의에 앞서서 사전 자료에서 혜택받는 사람과 기부 당사자의 이야기를 경청하는 것에서부터 시작한다. 그리고 그 부분이 얼마나 중요한지에 대한 내용들을 말씀하셨던 내용들을 봤었는데요. 특히 제가 한국에서의 제 기부 경험을 되짚어보면 모금단체 후원을 시작한 뒤에 활동 소식에 대한 뉴스레터를 받아보거나 아니면 후원의 밤 행사에 참여하거나 하는 등의 경험들이 있는데 이런 경험들은 시간이 지날수록 별다른 액션이 없으면 후원 사실 자체를 잊거나 불필요하다라고 생각해서 후원을 그만두게 되는 경우도 좀 있었습니다. 그런데 제가 이 사이트에서 찾아봤던 필란트로피 툴킷을 봤더니 이제 기부자들의 기부 동기와 가치를 재점검하고 그리고 다른 기부자들과의 교류하는 방법들을 제시하는데 이 방법들이 되게 구체적이고 꼼꼼하다라는 것에 되게 놀랐었습니다. 그 모든 과정이 하나의 첨예한 설득의 과정인 것처럼 보였는데요. 첫 번째 질문으로 툴킷을 활용하고 나서 확실히 기부자들의 자선 활동 관리나 기부 확산에 어느 정도 긍정적인 효과가 있었는지, 그리고 이러한 활동의 사회적 효과를 어떻게 측정하고 계신지 궁금하고요. 그리고 두 번째 질문으로는 기부자들을 위한 이런 학습 모델을 적용해 볼 만한 다른 영역이 어떤 게 있을지 그 부분에 대해서 한국의 음악 생태계에 대해서 말씀드리고 싶었는데요. 한국의 인디 음악 생태계는 K-팝의 위상에 비해서는 되게 열악한 현실입니다. 독립예술가의 창작 활동의 어떤 지속 가능성을 확보하는 미국의 좋은 기부 사례나 알고 계신 자금 매칭 사례가 있는지도 궁금합니다. 그리고 마지막으로는 결국 기부자가 자선 활동을 이뤄 나가기 위해서 마음 먹게 되는 가장 핵심적인 이유는 무엇이라고 생각하시는지 궁금합니다. 감사합니다.
Okay, I'm going to start with the last question, and I think we have good enough research findings to note that relationships between donors and the leads of nonprofits, staff of nonprofits, the direct experience of donors with nonprofits is one of the best predictors of ongoing giving and gratitude from the nonprofits. I mean, not in a insincere way, but just the actual physical thanking and the nature of human relationships really is a strong predictor of subsequent giving. Another strong predictor is making taking away any barriers that may make it harder to make, in social psychology they call it channel factors, things that channel behavior where you want it to go. So simplifying, giving. Obviously, you've all seen, an envelope where you can put a check, but maximizing the simplicity of continuing the giving. And then getting more to the artist questions, and then I'll get back to the toolkit question, I think ultimately. The Wallace Foundation is a large private foundation funded by wealthy donors. Now in now it's not, those donors are all deceased, so it's now just a standard private foundation. They've been looking at what happens when you try to establish a geographically meaningful artist collaborative, where you have kind of a hub and spoke model where they fund maybe a strong operating artistic organization in a community that can then be kind of a leader and help support other artists in that community. It may be too geographic for your example of the indie music scene in Korea, but I'm going to take a look at what the Wallace Foundation has done in that space. I have One of my best friends is the head of research there, so I can kind of ask her. I do think the movement towards collectives and collaboratives that Philanthropy Together exemplifies, the word Sarah Lomelin, the name Sarah Lomelin is there. That's a very fast moving trend in the US because people are finding that well, you all know that people's behavior is very strongly influenced by who they associate with, whether it's exercise or good diet or any of those things. And so what's happening now is we see more and more people spearheading like-minded communities of like-minded individuals, and their behavior really leverages one another's behavior. Somebody gives, so somebody gives, so somebody gives. So I think the idea of collectives and collaboratives, the idea of community-based models where you have a leader that can then kind of organize artist collectives within that community. And then about our toolkit, we ask everybody who uses it to give us feedback. And we know that it's effective in getting advisors to talk with donors about giving more strategically, systematically, and effectively according to the principles in the toolkit. It has that influence between an advisor and donor. Donors say they're going to take up those practices. We have not done what we say people should do and systematically followed the actual donor practices, which is a matter of resources for us. So I would say that advisors love the toolkit. They think it's the most effective way to talk to their donors about giving more and change the donors' behavior. But we don't have that next step of is it actually creating better outcomes in the nonprofits ultimately? So I think I answered all your questions backwards, and none of them probably are super satisfactory, but I'd love to see if anything happening at the Wallace Foundation would be pertinent to what you're talking about and potentially a model for the kind of collective that you're talking about.
Okay, are there any other questions on the floor? 질문 더 없으신가요? 네, so actually, I received one question from one of the participants, so I'll read it just in case. So I'm curious whether high levels of individual charitable donations in the United States are influenced more by societal and cultural factors or by tax deduction incentives that encourage charitable giving. Could you shed some light on this?
That's a really important question. And I think that for low-level donors, the answer is no, because they usually don't itemize their taxes, so they don't get the benefit of a tax deduction. So for anyone, that we would consider, working class, middle class, upper middle class, I'd say no. Not really upper middle class, but for most of these individual giving individual donors, the answer is no. As soon as you get into the upper echelons, I think it's very individual. People like Laureen Powell Jobs, Steve Jobs's widow, she doesn't do philanthropic giving. She does non-tax deductible. In other words, the Omidyar and Jobs and many of these people don't do things in a tax deductible way. They do things so that they have complete control and they can invest and get a return on those investments or give, and they have a much wider set of opportunities and are not accountable to the government. I think it's probably your lower echelons of the ultra wealthy that, so the high net worth donors that actually think in terms of, how do I get tax benefits? More systematically, because they tend to work with financial planners and financial advisors who say, okay, you can get this tax benefit. You're going to itemize your tax return. So it's very variable. Lower levels of giving, not about taxes. Higher levels of giving, about taxes. ultra high levels of giving about control. That's my simplified response.
Oh, it was a great answer. Like, I also think the segmentation is pretty much important, and it's also a factor. So we have 3 minutes left. I think we have one more question here. So, 용범님 혹시
네, 잘 들리십니까? 네, 잘 들리시나요?
네, 잘 들립니다.
네. 먼저 베라 선생님 강의 되게 잘 들었습니다. 제가 이 아산 프론티어 아카데미에서 들었던 강연 중에 제일 좋았습니다. 너무 제가 이 오늘 되게 피곤해서
I laugh, but go ahead.
후반부에 있어서 후반부만 듣고 이렇게 슬쩍 빠질까 생각했었는데 후반부를 안 들었으면 정말 큰일 날 뻔했다라는 생각이 들었습니다. 너무 생각할 거리를 많이 주셨고 스탠포드에서 만약에 이걸 강연했으면 한 학기짜리 강연을 압축해서 1시간 딱 맞춰서 거의 이렇게 예술가 시간을 지켜서 강의를 해줘가지고 너무 제가 배울 점이 많았던 것 같고요. 제가 질문 드리고 싶은 것은 2가지인데요. 먼저 이제 미국이 국제사회에서
Well, thank you very much.
미국이 국제사회에서 회원국으로 활동하면서 상당히 많은 그 기부금을 내고 있습니다. 그게 이제 회원국들이 내야 되는 분담금인데요. 유엔 같은 경우에도 4분의 1에 해당하는 그 예산을 미국이 부담하고 있고 그 똑같은 예산만큼 유네스코에도 4분의 1에 해당하는 만큼의 예산을 분담하고 있습니다. 그러니까 그게 국제사회에서는 어떻게 보면은 아무런 대가 없이 내는 그런 기부금이라고 저희는 생각하는데 선생님도 아시다시피 미국이 유네스코 회원국이었다가 탈퇴를 했고 바이든 행정부가 들어서고 나서 다시 재가입을 했거든요. 근데 이제 미국이 탈퇴를 하면서 4분의 1의 예산이 줄어든 국제기구들은 상당히 어려움에 처했습니다. 그런데 이제 다시 또 트럼프가 대통령이 되면 유네스코를 다시 탈퇴할 거라고 하는 암담한 그런 의견도 있는데요. 그런 부분에 있어서 저희 같이 이렇게 개인들이 할 수 있는 미국이 계속 국제사회에서 그렇게 큰 기여를 할 수 있도록 저희 개인들이 할 수 있는 역할이 무엇인지 궁금하고요. 그리고 미국의 그 자선의 역사에서 오늘 언급해 주셨으면 좋았을 거라고 생각 들었던 게 뭐냐면 미국은 강력한 독점 금지법의 전통이 있는 걸로 알고 있습니다. 록펠러도 그렇고 아까 말씀해 주신 그 빌 게이츠도 그렇고 기업들이 독점을 하면 미국 연방 정부가 법무부가 이렇게 기업을 분할하겠다라고 소송을 제기하면 그거에 대한 대가로 상당히 큰 기부금을 내고 또 재단도 만들고 사회적 공헌 활동을 상당히 활발하게 하는 그런 미국의 어떤 전통이 있는 걸로 알고 있는데요. 한국 같은 경우에는 이런 기업들이 독점하는 거에 대해서 정부가 상당히 밀어줘서 정부가 오히려 이렇게 기업의 어떤 독점을 좀 더 육성해줘서 대기업들이 탄생했거든요. 그러다 보니까 이런 독점 금지를 하는 전통이 상당히 미국과는 반대로 약합니다. 그러다 보니까 기업들이 이런 한국 사회에 기여하는 기부금의 비중이 미국과는 비교할 수 없을 정도로 약한데요. 그 부분에 대해서 선생님의 생각은 어떠신지 궁금합니다.
Yeah, this is interesting. First of all, what can individuals do to change the mood in America so that this America First kind of mentality doesn't destroy America's responsibilities towards and relationship with the rest of the world? And to half of Americans, it's just an incredible tragedy that that half of our compatriots think that we can isolate ourselves from responsibility and interconnected relationship with the rest of the world. It is an impossibility. It is a naivete, and it's a foolishness, plus a self-centeredness that those of us who don't agree with that stance almost can't understand. And what we understand is that it's a fear of loss of something that maybe was never even there, and that is a great America. What we are in now is a global community that absolutely has to work together, and if we don't, we're going to see a lot of harms. And I think there was just an article I read today saying from Market Watch, a pro-business publication, that said that undocumented immigrants in the United States are what keeps our Social Security system solvent, even though those undocumented immigrants don't get the benefit of Social Security, but they do pay into it from their wages. And so many of these assumptions and prejudices don't apply. I mean, they're just wrong-headed. When it comes to business regulation and the spirit of contribution in the business realm, I mentioned the neoliberal movement and the funding of the Chicago School of Economics pushed the American business model away from caring about all stakeholders, including workers in the community and environmental impact and a lot of other things, into just caring about shareholders. The philosophy that the only responsibility of business is to shareholders. That's being challenged right now. And the challenge is along the lines of showing that a lot of the problems we have with this America First movement and fear of losing ascendancy globally really comes from business not taking more into account than simply profit for shareholders. So I'd say the two questions you have are fairly interrelated and are ones that are major social issues in the US. And we're a little bit past time, but not much.
Okay, no worries. Okay, so it's 9:25, so we'll have to let Dr. Vera go. But it was a very interesting conversation and a very interesting lecture, because a lot of Korean people who are working for CSO and NGOs don't really know much about the US philanthropic sector. And in the discussion, I think we went from the local problems and also the global problems, and we also covered the essence of philosophy and also practical ways on how to build trust. So thank you very much. And before we let Dr. Vera go, we would like to take a group picture, if that's available. Would that be okay, Professor?
It would be wonderful. I'd love it. I just love
Okay,
it.
sure. So I'll just try to set the Zoom and try to show everyone right now. Yep. So we have this signature pose for the Assam Foundation, which is A. So if everyone can do an A here, it close to a monitor because of the filters, I guess.
Yeah.
We'll take a group picture. So
Wait, my A
one.
doesn't show up very well. You're right next to my head.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great. So 1, 2, 3. Yep, we're finished. Thank you again so much for the lecture. And I noticed that the time in the States when we started was 4 a.m. in the morning. And when I ask you if the time is too early, would it be possible, although the time is early? And you told us that the mission of Stanford PACS also is aligned with the Assam Frontier Academy, and that was very intriguing for us, and also I think for the participants also. So thank you very much again, and please give Dr. Vera a big round of applause.
Thank you all.